20 additional?
Well, I'll let Zeta know she can put another 20 on top of it.
Gotcha. Okay. Do we have anyone else or will we move on? Okay. Then I will take us to Bob Shaffer, our esteemed guest, farmer and agronomist. Thank you so much for joining us, Bob. I won't read through your bio. Everyone, I believe, has been distributed it and knows who you are and why they're here. So without further ado, screen sharing should be on and ready for you whenever you'd like to begin.
Well, thank you, Maurice, and thank you to the Rotary Club and to all you folks for coming together in a peaceful way today to talk about compost. It's not often that I get to relate the compost topic to peace. I really appreciate that because I was taught composting during the Vietnam War. My mother was fighting the Vietnam War, and somehow organic food and composting and fighting the war, that was one piece. And that's where I grew up. And so I've continued composting, and it's great to talk to you guys today about that. I'm sure that everyone here today is composting in some manner or another. Either we're taking care of our own food waste or we're professionally involved, possibly. Much thanks to you folks that teach composting here on the island. We certainly need more people teaching compost, as this is something that I have fallen into. Once again, I started making compost when I was young. When I started my first farms when I was 21, I was the composter. That's really all I knew how to do. And so I continued in that. And my observation is that the compost that I made, which was very simple at the time, did increase plant growth. We could see that clearly. We'd make compost, we'd put it on plants, and we'd watch. That's all we had. We would weed them, but we didn't have fertilizers. We didn't have herbicide or pesticides, but we had compost. And Robert Rodale had told us that compost provided everything, and I believed him. That is not true, but compost does provide us much help in raising plants, and you can see it. So this is a big topic, and I understand today that the inclination of this talk, or the topic of this talk, was to talk about compost on the home scale. If I'm incorrect about that, or you'd like to change the direction slightly or ask questions, I'm game. Questions are appropriate at any time. Please ask them. So to me, I raise compost on my farm. I build compost on my farm with Milo and others. I teach composting. I build compost with large scale folks, like in California with Recology Company. I think we're the largest compost company on the West Coast, or pretty big anyway. And I build little teeny compost all the time. As I'm completely addicted to compost, I must work with it every day. I find it to be the core material that I need to act as a consultant for farmers. Without compost, I'm unwilling to consult for farmers because I'm not going to get any place that is sustainable. I'm not going to get any place that is high quality. So for me, compost is food. Can any of you relate to compost as food? Is this a concept that we need to go into a little further? Because we can go very deeply into this, but simply I'm saying compost is a food for microorganisms in the soil. You notice I didn't say for the plants per se. In application, the compost to me is food for the soil organisms that will then feed the plants. So let's back up a step. That's saying how we apply the compost and for what purpose. So what is the compost process? What is it? Notice I use that word process. Composting to me, and maybe to yourselves also, is a process that we go through. It has a start, it has a finish, and it's quite predictable. If we know what we start with and how we process it, the compost, and how we cure it, those three things known in detail can tell you what you're going to end up with. Composting is a very simple, predictable process. And to me, that process produces food. Compost is the end food that I'm looking for. But what I'm doing in the compost process is feeding bacteria and fungi. This is no different than in the soil, feeding bacteria, fungi, feeding them compost. When I'm making the compost, we're feeding bacteria and fungi mulch. I heard that mulch term when I first got online today. I was a little late, but I heard the mulch term. So let's define mulch and compost a little bit so we don't get the two confused. I'm going to take mulch, or I'm going to take wood chips, or I'm going to take food scraps, and I'm going to put that in a process that favors bacteria and fungi so they can eat those things that I'm giving them. In composting, we call that feedstock. So I'm going to redefine mulch now as feedstock. Wood chips, green waste, recycled food, anything off the farm, processing waste, we can use as a material called feedstock to make compost. And all I'm doing with those materials is feeding them to bacteria and fungi. Bacteria and fungi are all over the mulch. They're all over the food scraps. And when we stack them up properly in a process where we have air and water, I'm giving them food now. I have air, water, and food to feed bacteria and fungi. Roughly, when we approach composting either as a small scale or a large scale, I'm going to be looking at the types of material, our feedstock, that we want to feed to my bacteria and fungi. And we're going to choose feedstock that's the appropriate food for bacteria and fungi. This is roughly 1 part green material and 3 parts brown material. Universally, across the nation, we've been taught to compost by mixing 1 part green material with 3 parts brown material. This is kind of like our diet. Think about your 1 part green as being protein and your 3 parts as being carbohydrate and oils and other stuff. We want a balance in our diet, right? If I just eat meat and fish and chicken, that's too much nitrogen, too much protein, not enough vegetables and fruit to give us antioxidants, enzymes, and carbohydrate. So I want a balanced diet for the bacteria in my gut. So in composting, when we have roughly 1 part green, this is by volume. Farmers work by volume. I can take a wheelbarrow, get 1 part green, take a wheelbarrow and get 3 wheelbarrows of brown and mix them together with enough water. And I'm going to have the appropriate food and water for bacteria and fungi to make compost. So what's green and what's brown? You can go online. Luckily now, unlike 30 and 40 years ago when we were composting, there wasn't much information to guide us. But now you can easily go online and check in on the things I'm saying and get further information on what is considered green material, what's considered brown. But to stay in grain with what we're doing today with small scale composting, our food scraps that come off of our table are so important as a green material. And we're qualifying our food scraps as being green because typically food scraps have quite a bit of protein in them, i.e. quite a bit of nitrogen, in other words. Contained in that protein in our food is nitrogen forms. So an example of greens from our food scraps would be all of the vegetables, either cooked or not, that are unwanted. Meat scraps, milk scraps, cheese scraps, any of this thing that goes bad in my systems are okay. Anything that is a concentrated protein or green source of material, literally green colored, is considered green material in our formula of feedstocks. Really importantly is the brown stuff. This is where we're going to get our carbon, is from the brown materials. On a home scale, a lot of times this is cardboard. Cardboard, leaves. Leaves are good, brown leaves, not green leaves. If they're still green, they go in the green pile. Brown leaves, cardboard, or the very most important feedstock that you can possibly get to make compost, wood chips. Do you know anybody that has wood chips just lying around? You know, a lot of times people have got a couple piles of wood chips just lying around that they don't want. I'm always looking for those because chips are a little more sturdy, if you will, than cardboard or newspaper or any paper materials that you have, or leaves. The wood chips, they stand up a little better to decomposition. And so if I can mix both soft sources of brown material like leaves and cardboard and paper with some wood chips, I have better porosity in my pile, and I have a better chance of keeping air and water at balance in my pile of compost feedstock. So let me take a breath for a second and maybe open up the floor for questions on what I just said, which is basically compost is a food for microorganisms in a soil, and composting, the process of composting, uses greens and browns at 1 to 3 as a food for bacteria and fungi to make the food that then goes into the soil. So do you have any experiences or questions that you'd like to ask about that? Am I making sense to you? Or would you like to have a little different angle of view on that, and where we start compost from and what they are?
Well, I think I understand you well so far myself, Bob, but I'm curious, does mulch qualify as wood chips then?
Mulch does qualify as wood chips. If you take the mulch in your hand, so as composters and especially as farmers, we need to use our hands and trust our hands and our sensory. So when I go to mulch and I pick it up and squeeze it, is there a roughness to it? Is there some pieces in there that are pretty big and I can identify them? I look and I go, oh, there's a little stick of ohia, or there's a little stick of my tulip tree. This is nice, rough, wood chippy mulch. This is very good. It's going to provide us the porosity that I'm looking for in the stacked feedstock. One of the things that we want to do is make a real clear distinction in our mind, the difference between mulch and compost. Sometimes this has gotten very confused. Let me show you. I know you can't see this exactly, but I'll tell you what this is. This is a really important document that was published in Hawaii about 20 years ago. And it was when the conversation, particularly in taro, was very hot about diseases and soil and how compost may or may not help us to prevent diseases, and the difference between compost and mulch. This document came out. It's called Mulch and Compost, Effects on Yield and Corm Rots of Taro. I won't name the authors, but it was authors here in Hawaii. I spent 3 years talking about this in this paper in public, many workshops, many talks on compost, Kauai, Maui, Big Island, because this paper is absolutely backwards and wrong. I went to Dr. Hollier from the university and described how wrong this paper was, and he agreed with me. It's never been retracted except in my discussions about it. I hope there's others that have found this and also helped to sort this out, because this paper, the authors mistake compost for mulch for compost. And they literally link the results of their trial to being that the mulch worked great and the compost didn't work.
Yes, backwards.
The difference between mulch and compost is the degree of decomposition that the material has experienced. Mulch has not been decomposed to any significant degree. You can still identify it with the human eye, what it is. When I look at mulch, I can tell you pretty much what it is. Lay it on a piece of paper, spread it out. Most of the content, I can tell what they are. It's a leaf, it's a stick, it's a rock. If you take well-made compost and lay it out on a piece of paper, you should not be able to tell where it's from. I do this with my students. I do this with farmers. I lay material out and I ask them to tell me what it is. And they go, well, it's compost. And I go, yeah, but look at all the particles. Can you tell what they are? And they go, well, no, I can't tell what it is. That's because it's went through the gut of a microbe and it's become humified. The difference between mulch that has not been decomposed and compost that has been decomposed by bacteria and fungi is the term humus, H-U-M-U-S. There's no humus in mulch. There's about 50% humus by weight in well decomposed, cured compost. Humus is a very special material. It's really only found in soils and compost, unless it becomes eroded out into the water, which it does, and becomes into the water like a silt and then floats off. But humus is made in soils. It's made by bacteria and fungi. It's made by the same bacteria and fungi. Humus is made by the same bacteria and fungi that are in the compost pile. That's where they came from. The bacteria and the fungi in the compost pile are from the soil. So we have these little organisms making humus for us in compost pile by their decomposition process. This is one of the things that bacteria and fungi are known to do, is decompose organic matter. Actually, interestingly, there isn't anything else known in science that decomposes organic matter in an agricultural system than bacteria and fungi in concert with nematodes and protozoa in the soil that make humus and compost. Isn't that amazing to think that we are incumbent to bacteria and fungi entirely to make humus, which is very possibly and verifiably the most important material in soil. Now that's a hard statement. It's kind of like saying, well, gosh, my heart is the most important thing in my body. Well, yeah, I think all of us, our whole being is important. We're a whole being. The soil is a whole being. Have you read James Lovelock's book from 1970 or so, Gaia, G-A-I-A? Oh my gosh, if you're interested in compost and the earth and farming, read Gaia. He's still alive, James Lovelock. But Mr. Lovelock, over the last 40 years, and along with science, has proven that, well, in our viewpoint anyway, that the earth is a live organism. And certainly composting embodies that sense of wholeness. And the soil as a whole being has humus in it that is very difficult to study. It doesn't have a regular X-ray diffraction signal. It is an amorphous material that's only produced by bacteria and fungi in soil and in compost. So when we compost, we as farmers are actually making an environment for bacteria and fungi. That's all I do as a composter. My very largest clients, Recology Company, if Greg was here or Kim was here, I would say the same thing to them, my bosses at Recology, that I say to you. All I do to make compost is adjust the process and the environment for bacteria and fungi. I am a bacteria and a fungi raiser, and I raise them with 1 part green, 3 parts brown, and I watch my water level and I watch my air level, and they, the bacteria and fungi, make compost for me. They make humus, and then I can apply it to the fields. That's all we have to do. It's a simple process, but it's a whole process that goes on in the soil all the time, and we are just imitating nature. That's all we're doing when we make compost. Don't make composting out to be too much about yourself or about the tractor or the turner or all the high-tech stuff. There is so much high-tech compost talk right now. Oh my gosh. I'm a very low-tech compost guy. 1 part green, 3 parts brown, proper porosity so I can get air in. All of the organisms that I'm feeding, bacteria and fungi, are air breathers. They're just like us. They're called heterotrophs. They need prefixed carbon. I can't photosynthate. I need prefixed carbon 3 times a day, and I need water all day long. My microbes in the compost pile need prefixed carbon 1 to 3, and they need water all day long, along with their air. Then they build humus. We watch, we see when the humus is ready, and we apply it to soils. Composting is a very simple process if you let it be that. Now, just
Mr.
to make
Shaffer,
sure- Yes, sir.
where do worms fit into this whole equation?
Ah, okay. Well, let's go back to nature just a second and give respect to that which we're from. And worms, earthworms, as we call them, here on Hawaii Island, we have a few introduced European species that are very excellent for agricultural soils. Those earthworms can be seen as one of the 9 soil surface dwelling animals that are endemic, indigenous to all systems on Earth. 9 little animals, macroscopic, you can see with their eyes, that have mandibles, they have teeth, including the worm, that work organic matter on the surface to take it down into smaller pieces. So that's where the earthworm is from. And in that environment, on the soil surface, the earthworm is consuming bacteria, fungi, and small pieces of organic matter, digesting them in its gut, and excreting pellets with high quality forms of NP and K, other nutrients, onto the soil surface and into their burrows. The earthworm is a magnificent animal to recycle nutrients and to make soils more porous. So clever individuals down through history watched earthworms and then reasoned that when the earthworm comes up into our compost piles, we could just farm the earthworms. So now we have wonderful systems with the Indian blue worm here on the island and with the red wiggler worm here on the island, as they're called. These are compost worms. They're kind of fragile worms. The blue worm using high temperatures a little better. The red worm using high temperatures a little better. The blue worm, no, just the opposite. I'm sorry, I'm backwards all the time. The blue worm is a little more high temperature. Aha. The red worm a little better in the lower temperatures. So with the two, we'll put those worms into an environment once again where they can help to decompose the organic matter. A lot of times what we feed worms in these systems is a little bit of finished compost, a little bit of food scraps that have been pre-composted to take the nitrogen out of them or to get the ammonia out. And then we use those as feed for the worms in the compost system. Is there a question, please?
Yeah, the tropical worm is the India blue worm, so it
Yeah.
it will digest things like citrus much easier. The red wiggler, being a temperate zone worm, does not. But I think of worms when I was teaching, I thought of worms in two different kinds. You have earthworms and you have compost worms. Earthworms are deep dwellers. They kind of have heads shaped like shovels, and their whole thing in life is aerating the ground. But compost worms take care of everything that falls in the top, say 3-4 inches of the soil. So they take care of everything that falls to the ground and they decompose it so it becomes part of the soil mixture. So, but
Well stated.
they're a great way to get high-powered fertilizer / soil amendment. Let's put it that way. They're really great.
Well put, and I think Ann is stating this right. And for us here in Hawaii, I'm glad that Alan brought up this question, because for us in Hawaii, we don't have a commercial compost source right now.
Damn.
We need commercial composting. However, that can take 2 forms if you ask me, 3 really. I always ask my farmers and my commercial clients to do 3 forms of compost. 1, thermal compost. We can do this relatively quickly. We can get to a decent state of composting within 90 days or so. Then we need some static compost for a more coarse material and for a compost that ends up more fungal. We can be making static compost in the background 100 to 200 days old, best at about 200-300 days old. Then, importantly, vermipost. That compost that's made with earthworms, we can be reducing waste from animals, our food scraps, our food waste from our island, one way or another, either in the backyard or in a more organized way around our cities, should be going to feed earthworms. As Ann noted, the earthworm is very good at staying in the surface. The composting earthworms are very good. They evolved in high humus conditions. They stay near the surface. They don't escape like Amanthus corticus does in our systems. And those compost earthworms, either the blue or the red, consume that soft organic matter and change it into a material that's highly concentrated and very favorable for plant growth. So all three forms, thermal, static, and vermipost styles of composting are appropriate for all farms and for commercial settings. I'm very interested in seeing Hawaii take the next step and be able to provide enough compost commercially or in small scale combined so farmers can compost their fields.
Yep.
I went out to my taro a couple days ago and I'm looking at it and I'm very tuned to my taro plants right now. And I'm standing there and I'm looking and I go, wow, look how green they are today. And I couldn't understand why. I hadn't applied any nitrogen. I hadn't applied any sulfur or any iron that would green the taro. But I could see it. They were greener. They looked very, very like they were metabolizing very high, photosynthizing very well, and they were quite green. I couldn't figure it out. And then Milo, who's on this meeting today and working here at my farm with Christina and others, noted to me, hey, Bob, remember we did get that taro patch composted about a week ago. I had forgotten we had applied compost right at the base of this 5-month-old taro. It greened it in 4 days. This is the effect of either well-cured vermipost, static compost, or thermal compost. All three will produce an end product that when placed properly at the base of a plant, you can see the results in a few days. This is the experience that I've had with compost since I was young. It's the experience I have with composting on thousands of acres that I in a compost now in California, other places. So again, good place for questions possibly. How much time do we have? I think we have 3 or 4 hours, don't we? So we'll have to make sure to address questions as they come. Yes, Ann.
The other thing is, if you apply chemicals like fertilizers and that type of chemicals, you can burn your plant. But because compost is totally organic, it will never damage a plant. It will never harm it. So that's a biggie.
Okay.
So-
I'll agree with that if the definition of compost as follows is what we're talking about. So when we say, for the purpose of this conversation, talking to me about compost, compost is a aerobic produced material that has went through the predictable phases. We started it, it went through processing, and then it was cured. It's in the curing that the potential for it to harm plants is eliminated. If we take compost only part way through a process and then apply it without curing, there is potential for damage because the ammonium and other breakdown products have not been fully cured.
Yep.
I have seen damage from compost when it was applied incorrectly and it was not
It
cured
wasn't finished compost.
That's right. This
That's
is like
the deal.
food. If you bring, so you sit down at a meal at a restaurant and they bring your food and it's half cooked, it's not right. It's not dinner.
And
So
you
gotta
could
send
get
it
ill.
back. Yeah, remembering always as composters, we're only serving food. So if I take my compost out and it's well prepared and it's cured, I'm serving a perfect meal to both my plants and to the bacteria and fungi that are living on the roots of the plants. Remember, anytime we apply material to the soil, whether it's a synthetic, whether it's a natural material, the first encounter of that material will be by bacteria.
Bye. See you later.
The
So-
bacteria are covering everything, so they will encounter that material before the plant root actually encounters it, and they'll let you know what's going on.
So Bob, how do we properly prepare our compost? I know you said 3-to-1 brown to green, and you helped us identify what's brown and what's green. But how do we go about doing it on a day-to-day basis in our homes? And what kind of composters should we be using? Or what would you advise for small scale home composting?
Okay, so let's separate this out to, when you say in the home, do you mean literally, I've got a bucket under the sink or over in the corner? We can talk about that. Or are you saying outside in the yard? Because those are two pretty different environments to compost in.
I would say in where we live here on the island, I think everyone's composting outside. I think in the city, people need to learn to compost inside, but yeah, outside composting.
Okay, so I don't forget this. I'm going to mention it first, and then I'll go back to answer this question very directly and very simply. But I want to mention first, either contact me.
Keep in mind, we only have 8 minutes left for the meeting.
All right, 30 seconds for this. So go online or call me or contact me and find Dr. Johnson compost generator. He's all over Google. He's all over any search you put out. Dr. Johnson, University of New Mexico, compost generator. He will show you step by step a gorgeous, simple, very effective, long-term use way to set up composting outdoors. Okay, that's 30 seconds on Dr. Johnson. Got 7.5 minutes. I am someone who simply, I can advocate to you to go out to a site on your farm or your place in the shade on soil, and you start a little compost pile. The first thing I'm going to do is lay down coarse material. I might start on a pallet or a couple pallets. You don't have to. You can start right on the ground. You can lay down a piece of ground cloth. There's a number of ways to approach this. And until you try it a couple times, each time you try it, you go, oh, I see what to do better the next time. There's a number of ways to start. A lot of times I'll just put down a piece of ground cloth, then start with coarse material. What is coarse material? The coarsest parts of the mulch, of the recycled organic matter from the county. Take the coarsest parts of that or any sticks that you have and lay them down in a circle or in a square in the shape that you're going to make your compost pile. This is the foot. This is the base. This is where we're going to try to have plenty of porosity so air can get in. Then I can take a hoop of wire or I can take concrete blocks, or I can take a couple of banana trunks and lay around this spot and kind of start to put some walls around it, or not. But a lot of times people feel more comfortable to use something to kind of contain the compost area. Once you have that, now we're going to start to feed in materials. 1 part green, 3 parts brown. Here's where the challenge comes. All of a sudden, oh, I had all this stuff I was going to compost. I put it down on my foot. Now I'm going to start composting. Where's all the rest of the material? I run out of material to compost quickly. So we're going to get all the leaves in there. We're going to get all of our grass clippings. We're going to get our food scraps going in. Anything that was alive once, more or less, and is somewhat chopped up into little smaller pieces. I'm not saying you have to chop everything up like you're chopping parsley for food, but just a little bit of porosity in there, a little bit of water, we're up in composting. Now, on the video that I directed you to Dr. Johnson's, you'll see that he's doing exactly what I just described, but he's putting a hoop of wire and a little shade cloth around it. So now we have a column. And into that column, I put my material, my feedstocks. we'll need to keep it just a little moist. So you always want to check your material as I build up my layers in my compost site. I'm going to check it with your hand for water, for moisture, and you should not be able to squeeze any water out. Certainly if it's so wet that water runs out when you squeeze your feedstock, that's too much. So anytime I have too much water, I don't have enough air. When I have not enough water, I've got too much air and it dries things. So I'm looking for my feedstock just to be wet enough where I really can't squeeze any water out. That's about 50% water. Composting, especially in the small scale, is the act of trying it. I encourage everybody, if you haven't composted, watch a couple of videos, watch Dr. Johnson's stuff. And again, just start a little area in the shade. We don't want the compost to get too hot. We don't want rain to fall through it. We're going to need to, I use plywood. I set a little piece of plywood on top of my compost pile. You can use plastic, but you got to make sure and take it off in between rains so it doesn't smother it. Remember, we're raising bacteria and fungi, so we don't want them to smother. But I just used a little piece of cardboard or a piece of plywood or a piece of tin to lay over the compost pile in the shade so it's not too hot and it doesn't get water running through it. If water runs through it, it's going to leach the pile and it's going to make it too wet. So we're making a little environment where I can maintain water relationship, where I can keep it a little bit cool, and where I've got good conditions under which bacteria and fungi can grow rapidly. 1 to 3 brown to green, a little bit of water, a little bit of shade. Now, got to start keep piling your compost up. I'd like to see the compost be maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. And at that point, if you can start out with that much material, it will have enough biomass that it'll start to heat a little bit. Heat is a good sign. We're basically making what's called thermal compost in those conditions. How else? So Dr. Johnson on his video will show you that you can use PVC pipe, non-toxic type pipe, to insert into the compost pile in the center. And this way we're allowing more oxygen to get in, because the higher you get your compost stack, the more weight it's going to be, and it's going to tend to crush it down. If you're really looking for some exercise, you can get a pitchfork and you can turn it. Tear it all apart, stack it back up again. Great fun. Good for the upper body. You don't have to do that, but that is another form of making compost where you turn it a little bit. The insertion of the pipes into compost piles and underneath them tries to limit the amount of turning that we have to do because it's labor intensive. Also, if we get enough air into the pile, this is very favorable for the development of bacteria and fungi, and we don't have to turn it, and that way we're not breaking up some of our favorable structures or possibly injuring some of the fungi while we're trying to build compost. So Dr. Johnson will show you the air tubes that we've used for many, many years going into compost piles, and they're recyclable and can be used over and over again. I think there was a question came on, and we're about out of time.
I think Doug was just bowing out. He has to go. We are coming up to a limit here on our time, but should give an opportunity for anybody to ask some questions. Can't see everybody, so
Bob, I have a question.
go ahead, Glenn.
Would an addition of topsoil in the compost pile help with the microorganism?
Yeah, thank you for that comment and question. It's one of the more ancient of techniques that actually has been verified by really good science now. Adding a small portion of soil to the feedstock while you're building the compost pile, does a couple things. It does introduce some bacteria and fungi, that's okay, but it introduces some clay. If the soil that you put in has clay in it, sometimes our soils have pretty nominal clay. So you may want to get down to the B horizon someplace and get some clay and put into that compost pile. Clay is a colloid. A colloid is this super tiny particle, and the bacteria have evolved with clay. They know it very well. Oddly, the bacteria are colloids also. They don't have any arms to grip anything. They can't hold on. So they attach themselves to the clay by charge. And once the bacteria in the compost process find that clay, they attach to it, and it acts like nucleating sites for the development of aggregates. The addition of clay to composting accelerates decomposition. It improves decomposition, both speed and effectiveness, and it ends up aggregating the compost quicker than feedstocks that don't have clay added to them. It's an excellent technique. Somewhere under 10% by weight is where you want to be. If I can hit even 2% by weight, I'm a pretty happy camper getting clay into compost. The Recology company actually dug me a big backhoe pit down into some B horizon soil that we access for the clay going into our composts. It's a super, super good idea. And it's one of those things that evolved out of small composters, because we all go out and we're scraping around our pile and you threw it up in it and you, it's okay, get a little soil in there. And you noticed over time, yeah, that works real good. Thank you for a great question.
You're welcome. Thank you for your presentation.
It's the only thing I like to do is talk about compost, frankly.
Oh, I'm sure there's other things.
Not much.
Do we have any other questions?
Can I just ask, is Dr. Johnson the one that does the keyhole composting concept? No, okay, never
No.
mind.
I don't think so. He's Dr. Johnson from the University of New Mexico.
Oh,
And his thing is a compost biogenerator, he calls it. Yeah, he is a genetic engineer, a PhD genetic engineer who got intrigued by compost. He likes to garden, but he told me they got intrigued by compost because people were referring to microbes and doing all these things. And he thought, oh, this can't be possible. Check out his list of microbes that he's found in compost. It's this long in fine print. And as he says, I'm a genetic engineer. I can find them even though we can't see them. They do PCR testing and they find the little protein fragments and all this stuff from them. Dr. Johnson, I don't know if he really knows this. I think he does. He has notched us up. He has put us in position to now better understand compost like no one has ever done before. He's only been public a couple years now. He was here in Hawaii. Myself and Jerry Ross, my partner in Maui, got a chance to spend a good time with him. And Dr. Johnson's the real stuff. His science knowledge on compost is real important.
I have one other question. If you have like sugarcane land and it has arsenic in it, you know, all these different type of inert bad metals in the soil, will the composting, using worms or otherwise help to ameliorate the problems with those kinds of soils?
It's a great question. And let's go back for a second and define, I'm not going to go through this in detail. By peer-reviewed science, we know there's 7 things that the organisms in soil do. One of them is the decomposition of toxins. Let's back this up. Is there anything else in soil that decomposes toxins? No. Bacteria and fungi, and it's mostly fungi. And when we apply compost, does that feed fungi? Yes. And so by applying compost to soils, it has been absolutely verified that toxic materials are more decomposed. I'm not saying it's done quickly, or 100%. But it definitely is how nature cleans up its soils, and we can use this. In fact, most of the breaking of hydrocarbons and cleaning up hydrocarbon infected soils is by natural organisms and molasses right now in the world. By the way, I was honored to be part of a team that sent 2 times. One, the county demanded, the state demanded, as I was working on a project on the Hamakua coast, that we needed to see clean soil on old cane land. The state demanded that I send the soil to a certain lab, and then the company I was working for sent the soil to a certain lab. And both of these came back with the only toxin that we found, and this agrees with EPA reports on Hawaii Island right now. The only toxins that we found were arsenic. So we gave the arsenic soil to the University of Hawaii, and they grew out 3 times corn on the arsenic soil, because the issue here is when you apply phosphate. Phosphate will break the bonds on arsenic and soil and allow it to come off of the clay and become more toxic. And at least on the soils we were working at, which is at the old Hina mill, Hina, the U of H came back with the report, I still have it, saying that that soil, even though it had an appreciable amount of arsenic, was not a threat to at least growing corn. The corn did not uptake it. The phosphate did not knock off enough phosphate that the corn uptook, that the arsenic showed up in the corn. So I think arsenic is a bad player, but at least in that soil, it wasn't going to cause too much trouble. But it is a threat. I was glad to see that there were not other materials in the old cane land that the EPA found, or 2 very expensive tests found.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to our group. Very informative as always. And yeah, I will definitely look up Dr. Johnson's video on the compost generator. I have started a compost bin here with a food grade steel barrel because it was cheap and easy, just $5 for the barrel, and made holes in it, and have been alternating with green and brown waste. And once a week I tilt it over on its side, and I put the top on and put it over on its side, and then I roll it around back and forth to agitate it. And yeah, I mean, so far it's looking good. And no foul smells or anything. So our neighbors are appreciative of that.
Yeah, compost should actually not smell, or should smell good. Anything we smell is something escaping, and I don't want it to escape. And almost every time there's smell, go back to I've got too much water or not enough, or I don't have enough carbon.
Oh, interesting, carbon. Okay, well,
Brown.
thank you. Alan, we have to talk about our worms.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Okay,
I'd like
thank
to-
you so much. Thank you. I think it's a good project. Maybe this is one we should do for every Rotarian family. This could be a peace project. This is an easy one.
Yeah,
Maybe.
absolutely. Well, Matt from Tin Shack has some composting he's doing there, and he's looking to do more on a larger scale, because he's going to be growing up there quite a bit. And he has a lot of invasive trees that he's taking out, and they're getting mulched, and all the mulch is getting spread out on the ground there. Yeah, so there's definitely going to be opportunities for us to learn more locally. Yeah, look forward to that as well.
Okay, we'll be talking then. Thank you. Thank you. Bye,
That will
everybody.
conclude our meeting. Thank you,
Okay,
everyone, for coming.
Bye, bye.
And Bob, I will give you a call. We'll talk more.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.